Alexander Harrington opened the hidden camera feed expecting to catch the maid crossing a line. Instead, he saw two empty wheelchairs in the middle of the room. His breath caught. Then the screen shifted, and his heart stopped. Liam and Lucas, his paralyzed twin sons, were standing, barefoot on the polished floor, wobbling, laughing, taking slow, uncertain steps toward Clara Beaumont's open arms. Alexander staggered back from the monitor. The tablet slipped from his hands and hit the floor. For 2 years, doctors had told him this was impossible. And yet, there it was, happening in his house, on his screen, without him. 2 years earlier, Alexander Harrington had learned how quickly a perfect life could collapse. The accident took his wife in seconds. The silence afterward took everything else. By the time the doctor spoke to him about Liam and Lucas, his heart was already numb, bracing for another blow. When they said the words permanent paralysis, he didn't argue, he didn't beg. He simply nodded. Hope, he learned, was dangerous. Alexander did what billionaires do best. He tried to solve grief with control. He hired the best specialists, built a mansion designed around accessibility, installed therapy equipment that cost more than most people's homes. And when caregivers disappointed him, cut corners, broke rules, or treated his sons like fragile objects, he added cameras. Not for protection, for proof. By the time Clara Beaumont arrived, Alexander wasn't looking for kindness. He was waiting for failure. But Clara didn't behave like the others. She spoke to the twins constantly, encouraged them, challenged them, treated them as if they were listening and capable. From behind his screens, Alexander watched, certain that believing again would hurt more than accepting never. He was wrong, and the cameras would be the ones to show him why. Before you begin, please take a moment to relax and enjoy the story. If you find it engaging, do me a small favor. Subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. I'd also love to hear from you, so feel free to comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your support means a lot and helps grow our community.
Alexander Harrington opened the hidden camera feed the same way he always did, without emotion, without hesitation. It was a habit now, something closer to instinct than choice. When trust failed, systems didn't. Screens didn't lie. People did. It was late. The house was quiet in that heavy, manufactured way that came from thick walls and money spent to keep the world out. Clara had been with the twins longer than scheduled that evening. That alone was enough to pull Alexander's attention back to the app glowing in his hand. He wasn't worried. He was expecting to confirm something. The feed loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, the familiar wide-angle view of the twins' living space coming into focus. Soft lighting, clean floors, everything where it was supposed to be. Then his eyes dropped to the corner of the frame. 2 wheelchairs stood near the window, positioned neatly side by side. Empty. For a split second, his mind refused to process it. His brain reached for the easiest explanation: camera glitch, angle distortion, delay. But his chest tightened anyway, a sharp, involuntary pull that stole the air from his lungs. Empty meant movement. Movement meant risk. His grip on the phone tightened. Had they fallen? Had Clara moved them without support? Had she tried something reckless? Something she wasn't trained or authorized to do? The panic came fast, surging up his spine before logic could catch it. Alexander leaned closer to the screen, his thumb swiping instinctively to adjust the angle. The camera reframed, and the world shifted. Liam was standing near the edge of the sofa, his small hands clenched at his sides, knees trembling but locked. His face was tight with concentration, jaw set in a way Alexander recognized immediately. It was the same expression he wore himself when forcing his way through impossible negotiations. A step away, Lucas stood too. Not supported, not strapped, standing. Lucas's posture wavered, his body swaying slightly as if learning gravity all over again. His feet were planted wide for balance, toes curling against the floor. One hand hovered in the air, not reaching for anything, just trusting. Alexander didn't breathe. The phone slipped a fraction in his hand, slick with sudden sweat. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every other sound in the room. He took an unconscious step back, his shoulder brushing the wall behind him as if he needed something solid to keep from falling. On the screen, the boys stood there, shaking, focused, alive in a way Alexander hadn't seen since before the accident. Not cured, not whole, but upright, standing in defiance of every report, every scan, every carefully constructed certainty Alexander had built his life around. He didn't move, didn't call out, didn't rewind. He stood frozen in the dark, watching the impossible exist quietly in the corner of his own home. And for the first time in years, Alexander Harrington had no system, no protocol, no explanation to hide behind. Before everything broke, Alexander Harrington's life ran on certainty. Certainty was his currency long before money ever was. It was how he built Harrington Global from a risky acquisition firm into a market-moving empire. He trusted forecasts, models, controlled variables. Emotion never made decisions. Numbers did. Outcomes followed logic. Logic followed discipline. And discipline never fails him. His days were timed down to the minute. Mornings began before sunrise, the city still quiet beneath his penthouse windows. Meetings stacked cleanly, negotiations executed without wasted words. People mistook his calm for coldness, but it wasn't detachment, it was mastery. Alexander didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. Control spoke for him. And then there was his family. That certainty followed him home. The Harrington estate used to hum with life, not noise, intention, order without emptiness. Liam and Lucas were born strong, loud, demanding, identical down to the dimple in their left cheeks, inseparable from the moment they arrived. Alexander remembered holding them, one in each arm, their fingers curling instinctively around his thumbs, like they already trusted him to keep them safe. His mother used to laugh at that. She said the boys knew exactly who he was. Evenings were predictable in the best way. Dinner at the long oak table, the twins in their high chairs, dropping food deliberately just to watch it fall. Alexander pretending not to notice while committing every second to memory. He told himself he had time, that this fullness was permanent. The future felt assumed. There were plans already in motion, private schools selected before the boys could speak, a summer home by the lake, travel schedules built around milestones that hadn't happened yet. First steps, first words, first fights, first victories, first heartbreaks Alexander believed he'd be ready to fix. He was used to fixing things. He believed that if you prepared enough, invested enough, cared enough, outcomes aligned. Nothing in his world suggested otherwise. His home reflected that belief. Clean lines, open spaces, light pouring in through glass walls. Not sterile, but intentional. Everything had a place. Everything made sense. The boy's laughter echoed down the hallways, grounding him in a way no market success ever could. Alexander had never believed in luck. He believed in structure, in effort, in reward. So when he held his sons and imagined their future, running through these halls, racing each other down the stairs, growing into men who carried his name forward, it didn't feel like hope, it felt like certainty. That was the life before fractures, before doctors spoke in careful tones, before words like unlikely and permanent entered his vocabulary, before control failed him for the first time. Back then, Alexander Harrington didn't watch his world through screens. He lived inside it. And he never once considered that everything he trusted, everything he believed unbreakable, was already standing on a fault line, waiting for a single moment to shatter it all.
The accident didn't arrive with warning. It never does. One moment, life was moving forward exactly as planned. The next, everything Alexander Harrington believed in collapsed into chaos. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind so unremarkable it barely registered as memory until it became the last normal one. Rain slicked the roads, late but steady. The driver had taken that route 100 times before. Alexander had approved the security measures himself. Armored vehicle, trained staff, contingency plans layered on contingency plans. Certainty had been built into every detail. And still, it wasn't enough. The impact came from nowhere. Metal screaming against metal, glass shattering in a sound so sharp it felt like pain itself. The world twisted violently, momentum snapping seatbelts tight, bodies thrown forward, time stretching and collapsing all at once. Alexander remembered shouting the boys' names. He didn't remember hearing himself. When he woke up, everything was white, too white. The ceiling lights burned into his eyes as voices spoke above him, urgent and controlled. He tried to sit up. Hands pushed him gently back down. "Your sons are alive." The words landed before anything else did. Alive. Relief surged through him so hard it made him dizzy. He asked where they were. He asked if they were hurt. He asked questions in rapid succession, his mind already rebuilding, already calculating what came next. The answers came slower. They told him the twins had taken the worst of it, that their bodies had been protected but not unscathed, that swelling in the brain had caused damage, that scans showed extensive trauma to areas responsible for motor control. The doctor's voice stayed professional, careful, softened by experience. "Mr. Harrington, we need to prepare you." Alexander stared at the man's mouth, watching it move without hearing the rest. Prepare meant permanent. Permanent meant irreversible. Words he'd never accepted in business, in life, in anything that mattered. The twins survived, but they would never be the same. Weeks passed in a haze of hospital corridors and sterile rooms. Machines hummed constantly. Liam and Lucas lay still in beds too big for them, their small chests rising and falling under thin blankets. Alexander held their hands, willing them to squeeze back. Sometimes their fingers twitched. Sometimes nothing happened. Doctors explained. Specialists confirmed. Therapists outlined future plans that sounded less like hope and more like maintenance. "They may never walk. The damage is severe," one said gently. Alexander nodded. He listened. He absorbed information the way he always had, clinically, methodically, while something inside him quietly shut down. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He adapted. That was what he told himself. He authorized treatments, approved equipment, signed forms without reading them twice. He made decisions like a man executing a plan, because planning was safer than feeling. At home, the estate felt unfamiliar. The laughter was gone. Toys sat untouched. The twins' room became a place he avoided. He converted spaces into therapy areas, medical suites, places designed for function rather than joy. When the boys finally came home, they came in wheelchairs. Small bodies strapped in, eyes distant, movement limited to what the damage allowed. Alexander stood in the doorway and watched, his expression unreadable, his heart sealed tight. This was the new reality, and Alexander Harrington did what he had always done when confronted with something he couldn't control. He shut the door on hope before it could break him, because believing again meant risking everything he had left.
The doctors stopped using careful words once the results were final. They gathered in a quiet conference room lined with light panels and digital screens. Images glowed against the walls. Cross-sections of brains, highlighted regions, arrows pointing to areas marked in clinical colors. Alexander sat at the table with his hands folded neatly in front of him, spine straight, face composed. He looked like a man attending a board meeting, not a father being told his sons would never walk. The lead neurologist spoke first. "These scans show extensive damage to the motor cortex and connecting pathways," she said, her voice calm, practiced. We've repeated the imaging. The findings are consistent. Another doctor leaned forward, sliding a tablet across the table. Charts, timelines, percentages. The injuries are permanent. Permanent. The word echoed in the room, heavy and absolute. A third voice followed, softer but no less firm. With current medical understanding, this kind of damage is considered irreversible. Irreversible. Alexander nodded once. They continued talking, explaining what life would look like from now on. Wheelchairs designed to grow with them. Physical therapy focused on preventing deterioration, not achieving recovery. Language carefully shaped to sound compassionate while drawing a line no one was expected to cross. We want to be clear, the neurologist said. Hope is important, but unrealistic expectations can cause harm, emotionally, psychologically. It's healthier to focus on achievable goals. Achievable. The word felt smaller than the others. Alexander listened to every sentence. He asked measured questions. He requested clarification on timelines, on support structures, on long-term projections. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Inside, nothing moved. When they finished, the room fell quiet. The doctors watched him closely, waiting for a reaction. Anger, grief, denial. They were used to all of it. Alexander gave them none. "Thank you for your honesty," he said evenly. "I appreciate direct information." The meeting ended. Hands were shaken, condolences offered in the language professionals used when outcomes were sealed. Outside the conference room, the hospital corridor stretched long and bright. Alexander walked through it alone, his footsteps measured, his breathing steady. He passed families clinging to hope, parents whispering prayers, children learning how to walk again with the help of parallel bars and patient hands. He didn't look at them. At Liam and Lucas's bedside later that afternoon, he stood with his hands in his pockets and studied their faces. Tubes, monitors, tiny limbs still and quiet. They looked peaceful, unaware of the verdict delivered in another room. Permanent, irreversible, never. Alexander repeated the words silently, not as a challenge, not as an argument, but as data points, facts to be filed away. Accepting them felt safer than fighting them. Hope, he realized, was an unstable variable. He had lived his entire life eliminating uncertainty, building systems that left no room for chance. Hope was chance dressed up in faith, and faith, in his experience, had a way of demanding everything and giving nothing back. So he reframed it. Hope wasn't courage, it was risk. Risk led to disappointment. Disappointment led to collapse. He would not collapse again. Standing there in the soft mechanical hum of the hospital room, Alexander made a quiet decision. He would give his sons the best care money could buy. He would protect them from suffering. He would make their lives comfortable, structured, safe. But he would not allow himself to believe in miracles. Because believing once had already cost him more than he could bear. He reached out and adjusted Lucas's blanket, smoothing the fabric with precise movements. Then Liam's. The motions were careful, practiced, controlled. A nurse answered and spoke softly, explaining the next round of tests. Alexander nodded and stepped aside. He left the hospital that evening with the doctor's words firmly in place, not as wounds, but as walls. And behind those walls, he locked hope away, convincing himself that never was simply another word for certainty. The doctors stopped using careful words once the results were final. They gathered in a quiet conference room lined with light panels and digital screens. Images glowed against the walls. Cross-sections of brains, highlighted regions, arrows pointing to areas marked in clinical colors. Alexander sat at the table with his hands folded neatly in front of him, spine straight, face composed. He looked like a man attending a board meeting, not a father being told his sons would never walk. The lead neurologist spoke first. These scans show extensive damage to the motor cortex and connecting pathways, she said, her voice calm, practiced. We've repeated the imaging. The findings are consistent. Another doctor leaned forward, sliding a tablet across the table. Charts, timelines, percentages. The injuries are permanent. Permanent. The word echoed in the room, heavy and absolute. A third voice followed, softer but no less firm. With current medical understanding, this kind of damage is considered irreversible. Irreversible. Alexander nodded once. They continued talking, explaining what life would look like from now on. Wheelchairs designed to grow with them. Physical therapy focused on preventing deterioration, not achieving recovery. Language carefully shaped to sound compassionate while drawing a line no one was expected to cross. We want to be clear, the neurologist said. Hope is important, but unrealistic expectations can cause harm, emotionally, psychologically. It's healthier to focus on achievable goals. Achievable. The word felt smaller than the others. Alexander listened to every sentence. He asked measured questions. He requested clarification on timelines, on support structures, on long-term projections. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Inside, nothing moved. When they finished, the room fell quiet. The doctors watched him closely, waiting for a reaction. Anger, grief, denial. They were used to all of it. Alexander gave them none. Thank you for your honesty, he said evenly. I appreciate direct information. The meeting ended. Hands were shaken, condolences offered in the language professionals used when outcomes were sealed. Outside the conference room, the hospital corridor stretched long and bright. Alexander walked through it alone, his footsteps measured, his breathing steady. He passed families clinging to hope, parents whispering prayers, children learning how to walk again with the help of parallel bars and patient hands. He didn't look at them. At Liam and Lucas's bedside later that afternoon, he stood with his hands in his pockets and studied their faces. Tubes, monitors, tiny limbs still and quiet. They looked peaceful, unaware of the verdict delivered in another room. Permanent, irreversible, never. Alexander repeated the words silently, not as a challenge, not as an argument, but as data points, facts to be filed away. Accepting them felt safer than fighting them. Hope, he realized, was an unstable variable. He had lived his entire life eliminating uncertainty, building systems that left no room for chance. Hope was chance dressed up in faith, and faith, in his experience, had a way of demanding everything and giving nothing back. So he reframed it. Hope wasn't courage, it was risk. Risk led to disappointment. Disappointment led to collapse. He would not collapse again. Standing there in the soft mechanical hum of the hospital room, Alexander made a quiet decision. He would give his sons the best care money could buy. He would protect them from suffering. He would make their lives comfortable, structured, safe. But he would not allow himself to believe in miracles. Because believing once had already cost him more than he could bear. He reached out and adjusted Lucas's blanket, smoothing the fabric with precise movements. Then Liam's. The motions were careful, practiced, controlled. A nurse answered and spoke softly, explaining the next round of tests. Alexander nodded and stepped aside. He left the hospital that evening with the doctor's words firmly in place, not as wounds, but as walls. And behind those walls, he locked hope away, convincing himself that never was simply another word for certainty. Time began to move differently after that. Weeks passed, then folded into months, marked not by progress, but by repetition. The same therapy rooms, the same routines, the same careful optimism in voices that no longer convinced anyone. calendars filled with appointments, evaluations, reassessments. Each one promised review. None offered change. Liam and Lucas were transferred home, their world shrinking to corridors wide enough for wheelchairs and rooms modified for access. Parallel bars stood unused. Therapy mats remained neatly arranged. Devices designed to stimulate muscles were wheeled in and wheeled out again, their settings adjusted, their results unchanged. Alexander spared no expense. He brought in specialists from across the country, then from abroad, neurologists with impressive credentials, rehabilitation experts who spoke of emerging research, therapists who claimed small successes elsewhere, always careful to frame them as rare but possible. He funded experimental programs, private sessions, customized equipment built specifically for the twins' bodies. Each attempt carried the same quiet hope, unspoken but present. Each one ended the same way. No milestones were reached, no first steps, no breakthroughs whispered about late at night. The boys learned to maneuver their chairs with more precision. Their upper bodies grew stronger. They smiled more. They laughed when they were together. But their legs remained still. The doctors adjusted their language over time. Stability is good, they said. Preventing regression is a success. They praised Alexander's dedication, his willingness to try everything. They spoke of quality of life instead of recovery. Alexander listened. He nodded. He approved invoices and schedules and upgrades. He did not argue when timelines quietly disappeared from conversations. Inside the therapy rooms, he often stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching his therapist's coaxed movement that never came. Encouragement filled the air, soft and persistent. Try again. You're doing great. Any sensation at all? Sometimes Liam's brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes Lucas clenched his jaw, frustrated. Then they would look toward their father, searching his face. Alexander kept his expression neutral. He learned how to smile without promising anything. At night, he reviewed footage from the house's cameras, not out of suspicion yet, but out of habit. He watched routines play out the same way every day. Meals, therapy, rest, order. Predictability replaced hope. As months wore on, the quiet belief that something might change began to erode, not dramatically, not all at once. It faded the way light does at the end of a long day, almost unnoticeable until darkness settles in completely. Alexander stopped asking certain questions. He stopped researching new treatments late at night, stopped following medical journals for stories that hinted at miracles. When someone mentioned an unproven method, he listened politely and moved on. He told himself it was acceptance. Acceptance sounded healthier than surrender. The house adapted around the twins, but the future no longer expanded beyond what was already visible. Education plans were adjusted, life trajectories rewritten without discussion. Alexander made decisions quickly, efficiently, without emotion attached to them. This was reality. The boys adapted better than he did. They found joy in small things. They competed in games from their chairs. They teased each other, laughed loudly, filled spaces Alexander thought would remain quiet forever. Watching them, something inside him twisted uncomfortably. Hope, he realized, hadn't disappeared. It had simply been buried, layer by layer, under disappointment, data, and time. And Alexander helped cover it. Every therapy session that ended the same way, every report that said no change, every specialist who used the word manage instead of restore. He told himself this was strength, that protecting his heart was necessary, that believing in nothing hurt less than believing in something that refused to arrive. So he built a life that required no miracles, and in doing so, he convinced himself that hope was not only unrealistic, but unnecessary. He didn't notice the cost of that belief. Not yet.
The cameras went in quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic decision point, just a series of installations approved between meetings and conference calls, disguised as upgrades to security and efficiency.
Alexander told himself it was practical. A house this large needed monitoring. His sons needed protection. Staff needed accountability. The technicians moved through the estate with discreet efficiency, drilling, wiring, calibrating. Small black lenses appeared in corners, blended into smoke detectors, tucked behind decorative trim. Hallways, therapy rooms, common areas. Even the twins' shared living space, positioned carefully to avoid anything that could be considered invasive, at least on paper. Alexander watched the feeds from a private room off his study, where a wall of screens glowed softly in the dark. Each camera labeled, each angle precise, nothing left to chance. At first, it gave him comfort. He could see everything: who entered, who left, how long caregivers stayed with the boys, whether routines were followed exactly as prescribed. There were no surprises, no gaps where something could go wrong unnoticed. Trust became unnecessary. Care, once something intimate and instinctive, was reduced to checklists and timestamps, medications administered on schedule, exercises completed, meals eaten, every task verified by a digital eye. Alexander no longer needed to ask how the boys' day had gone. He could see it. He stopped sitting beside them during therapy sessions, stopped joining them for meals unless it was scheduled. Physical presence felt redundant when observation was constant. He told himself this was efficiency, not distance. But the house grew quieter. Conversations shortened. Laughter felt contained, as if it existed only within permitted boundaries. Staff spoke carefully, aware they were always being watched. Interactions became polite, professional, bloodless. Alexander preferred it that way. Emotion complicated things. Emotion led to disappointment. Systems did not. He found himself spending evenings alone in the surveillance room, watching his sons from afar. Liam adjusting his chair near the window, Lucas tapping rhythms against the armrest, lost in his own world. The routines played out like clockwork, predictable and safe. He told himself this was involvement. In truth, it was avoidance. When the boys looked toward the cameras, sometimes directly, sometimes not, Alexander felt a flicker of something he refused to name. Guilt, perhaps, or grief. He pushed it down and adjusted the angle instead. Watching was easier than engaging. Engagement required vulnerability. It required questions he didn't want to answer. It required acknowledging the space between what was and what might never be. The cameras didn't ask anything of him. They simply showed. Care became procedural. Affection became assumed rather than expressed. Alexander approved care plans, reviewed footage, and signed off on reports. He knew everything that happened in the house, yet felt increasingly removed from it. When caregivers came and went, he evaluated them through screens first, conversations second. Any deviation from routine was noted, any inefficiency corrected. Mistakes were caught early, addressed quickly. Control tightened its grip. And somewhere along the way, Alexander stopped being a father who held his sons' hands and became a man who monitored them instead. The screens reflected back a version of life that was orderly, managed, contained, but they could not show what was missing. They could not show the weight of silence between father and sons, the absence of spontaneous touch, the way love, when filtered through lenses and protocols, slowly thinned until it resembled obligation more than connection. Alexander told himself this was what strength looked like now. He didn't yet realize that by watching everything, he was no longer truly present for anything at all.
Clara began breaking the rules quietly. Not the obvious ones, not the kind written in manuals or posted on the walls of therapy rooms. These were subtler, unspoken rules that had settled into the house over time. Rules about expectation, about limitation, about how much was allowed to be asked of two boys the world had already decided for. She talked to the twins constantly, not in the careful, measured way professionals used, where every word felt rehearsed and safe. Clara spoke to them the way people spoke to others they believed would answer. She narrated the morning light spilling through the windows, commented on the weather, asked what they wanted to listen to, what they liked, what they remembered. She told them stories while folding laundry, asked them to help choose shirts, socks, music. She waited for responses, not just verbal, but shifts in posture, changes in breathing, the smallest flickers of engagement. And then she started encouraging movement. At first, it was nothing dramatic, a request to press a foot into the floor, to straighten a knee for a moment longer than usual, to grip her fingers just a little tighter. She framed each effort as temporary, as play, as something worth trying, not as therapy. "Let's see what happens," she would say. From the surveillance room, Alexander felt his chest tighten. This wasn't her place. The boys had regimens, schedules approved by specialists, boundaries drawn carefully around what was safe, realistic, allowed. Clara stepped just beyond them, not recklessly, but deliberately. Then the changes began, small enough to dismiss, easy to rationalize. Liam's fingers curled more deliberately around a spoon. Lucas shifted his weight without prompting. A leg held steady for an extra second before giving out. Clara noticed every change, but she didn't celebrate them loudly. She simply acknowledged them, like expected outcomes. "See," she said once, smiling softly, "your body remembered." Alexander replayed that moment more times than he admitted. The laughter came next. It startled him more than the movement. It wasn't the polite, prompted laughter caregivers encouraged. It was spontaneous, sharp, uncontrolled, the kind that caught in the throat and spilled out before anyone could stop it, the kind that echoed through hallways that had been quiet for too long. Alexander muted the sound at first, then unmuted it, then sat very still as it filled the room. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Every instinct in him told him to stop it, to call the doctors, to remind Clara of boundaries, to shut down whatever false hope was forming before it took root. Hope was dangerous. He had learned that already. Hope was what made loss unbearable. As the days passed, Alexander's fear grew, not of Clara, but of what she was awakening. The boys seemed more present, more engaged. Their eyes followed movement with intent. Their bodies responded faster, as if something dormant was stirring. Nothing miraculous, nothing definitive, just enough. Enough to make Alexander's stomach knot every time he opened the camera feed. He told himself it was coincidence, temporary fluctuation, the mind playing tricks on him because he was watching too closely. But deep down, another truth pressed against his chest, heavy and unwelcome. If this continued, everything he had accepted might unravel, and he wasn't sure he could survive that again. So he watched more, obsessively, every interaction, every movement, every laugh, waiting for it to fail, waiting for the moment he could tell himself he'd been right to stop believing. But that moment didn't come. Instead, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't for years, and Alexander, surrounded by screens and certainty, found himself afraid, not of loss this time, but of the fragile, terrifying possibility that hope might be real.
Clara Beaumont arrived without disruption. No grand introduction, no exaggerated confidence. She was simply there, one morning, standing in the entryway with her hands folded neatly in front of her, posture relaxed, expression calm. Her file had been reviewed and approved like all the others. Background checks clear, references solid, nothing remarkable on paper. Alexander barely looked at her at first.
It was the cameras that noticed her. She moved differently from the others. Not rushed, not mechanical. She didn't fill silence with chatter or retreat into efficiency. She took time, standing still in rooms, observing before acting, as if listening to something no one else could hear. From the surveillance room, Alexander watched her settle into the house with unsettling ease. She learned the routines quickly, but she didn't cling to them. When she spoke to Liam and Lucas, she knelt to their eye level instead of hovering above them. She addressed them directly, never through their chairs, never as if speaking to someone else in the room. Most caregivers spoke about the twins. Clara spoke to them. Her voice was steady, warm without being forced. She asked questions and waited for answers, even when the responses came slowly or not at all. She didn't finish their sentences, didn't assume their needs. She treated pauses not as failures, but as part of conversation. Alexander found this irritating. Care had a rhythm, a system. Clara seemed uninterested in both. She encouraged the boys to do things for themselves when possible, adjusting their positions, reaching for objects placed just slightly out of easy range. Small acts that, to Alexander, looked inefficient, even risky. When one of the twins struggled, she didn't rush in immediately. She watched, patient, alert, ready, but not interfering unless necessary. Through the cameras, Alexander leaned forward in his chair. This was not protocol, yet the boys responded to her in ways he hadn't seen in a long time. Liam's eyes followed her movements. Lucas laughed more freely, his attention sharper, his posture subtly different when she was near. Clara spoke to them as if they were capable, not fragile, not limited. She never used the careful language Alexander had grown accustomed to. No euphemisms, no soft disclaimers. "You've got this," she said once, when Lucas struggled to steady himself when transferring. "You're stronger than you think," she told Liam, adjusting his feet on the floor. Alexander rewound the footage, watched again. There was nothing dramatic happening, no clear violation, just a quiet confidence in the boy's abilities that made him uneasy. She did not treat them as broken. That unsettled him more than outright incompetence would have. From that day on, Alexander watched Clara closely. He tracked how much time she spent with the twins, how often she deviated from routine, how the boys' moods shifted in her presence. He expected to find something wrong, a lapse, a moment of carelessness. Instead, he found consistency, patience, and attention that did not waver when the cameras were surely watching. Clara never glanced at the lenses. It was as if she didn't know they existed, or didn't care. That made Alexander uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate. He was used to being unseen behind the screens, the quiet authority observing everything. With Clara, it felt different. She wasn't performing, she wasn't trying to impress. She simply showed up, fully present, in a house where presence had long been replaced by observation. And for the first time in years, Alexander found himself watching not out of control, but out of confusion, because something in the house had begun to shift, and he didn't yet understand why.
Alexander didn't mean to open the feed that morning. His thumb hovered over the security app out of habit, not intent. Surveillance had become muscle memory, something his body did even when his mind resisted, a reflex built from months of watching instead of living. The screen loaded slowly, too slowly. When the image sharpened, the first thing he noticed was the room's stillness. Morning light stretched across the floor in long, pale bands. The toys were where they were supposed to be, the chairs positioned exactly as they always were. Except they were empty. Alexander felt it before he understood it. A sharp drop in his stomach, like missing a step in the dark. His breath stalled halfway in. He leaned closer to the screen, eyes scanning, counting. 2 wheelchairs, both unoccupied. Panic surged, hot and immediate. He switched cameras, then another. His fingers moved faster, clumsier. The house felt suddenly enormous, dangerous in its quiet. His mind leapt to every possible explanation: falls, accidents, mistakes he had been too distant to prevent. "Clara," he muttered, already bracing for the worst. Then the camera reframed. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if the house itself was taking a breath. And there they were. Liam stood first, both hands gripping the edge of the sofa, knuckles pale with effort. His legs trembled, thin muscles straining under a weight they had not carried in years. His jaw was clenched, eyes focused straight ahead, not on the floor, not on fear, but on Clara. Lucas stood beside him, not supported, not lifted, standing. His posture was unsteady, imperfect, but unmistakable. One foot shifted forward, tentative, testing the ground as if it might disappear beneath him. Clara was close enough to catch him, but she wasn't holding him up. She wasn't touching him at all. "Easy," she said softly, her voice calm, unwavering. "I'm right here." Alexander's phone slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor, the sound dull and distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. His back met the wall behind him as if his body needed something solid to keep from collapsing. On the screen, Lucas took a step, then another. Liam followed, slower, his movements careful but determined. Their faces were flushed with effort, eyes bright with something Alexander hadn't seen in years: focus, presence, belief. They were walking toward Clara. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but undeniably. Alexander's chest burned. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would drown out the sound from the speakers if he reached for the phone again. He didn't. He couldn't. Everything he had built his world on, certainty, acceptance, control, cracked open in that moment. The words he had repeated to himself for years echoed uselessly in his mind. Permanent, irreversible, never. They dissolved as he watched his sons move through space under their own power. Tears blurred his vision, and he didn't wipe them away. He didn't care. The man who had trained himself not to hope, who had buried belief like a liability, stood frozen as something impossible unfolded in his living room. This wasn't a miracle broadcast for an audience. This was quiet, private, earned, and it shattered him. Because if this was possible, if this had been possible all along, then the greatest thing he had lost wasn't time or money or certainty. It was faith. And as Liam laughed, breathless, triumphant, and Lucas reached out toward Clara with shaking hands, Alexander felt something inside him collapse and reform all at once. The walls he had built to protect himself from hope fell away, and for the first time since everything broke, he believed again. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. These moments matter, and there are many more waiting for you here. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. We love seeing how far these stories travel.